Good afternoon and welcome to Brain Injuries in Sports. How can we help our athletes? This is the first panel discussion of our third season of the Digital Futures Flashpoint series, which is a series of conversations of consequence, sponsored and hosted by the UC Office of Research and Digital Futures, which is a technology-forward research program driving societal transformation using use-inspired applied research. My name is Pat Limbach, and I serve as the University of Cincinnati's Vice President for Research. I'm excited to have you all here today for this sensational panel discussion amongst people passionate about partnering to solve a problem that matters, which is concussions. On the heels of Miami Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa revealing that he did not remember being carted off the field after suffering a concussion, this panel of thought leaders will discuss the realities of brain trauma, policy, and the cutting-edge brain injury research that's happening right here at the University of Cincinnati. I want to give a quick shout out to the Office of Research staff and others on the Flashpoint series team who work hard to bring these extraordinary events together. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Jay Shabria. Jay has served at the highest levels of business and government, such as the senior advisor to former Ohio Governor John Kasich. Currently, Jay is a managing director at MAD Global Strategy, and in that capacity, he works closely with the UC Office of Research Leadership to help us scale up our digital futures efforts.
Pat, thanks a lot. I appreciate it very much. And as Pat said, this is our third year of hosting this Flashpoint series. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to highlight the research expertise at UC and talk about it in real world terms. And as Pat said, it's all about solving problems that matter. And in the last decade, our society has been becoming aware of the plague of brain injuries many of our athletes are experiencing. Football has been under a microscope, no doubt about it. And we've got some great football specific guests here. But brain injuries are also a problem in soccer, in lacrosse, field hockey, gymnastics, and other sports. It hits young men, it hits young women. It's something that's really is really pervasive in our society. This is the definition of a problem that matters, and our panel is going to dive into it. Before we get to the panel, I want to talk a little bit about Research and Innovation Week. It's one of those highlight weeks here at the Office of Research for University of Cincinnati. It's going to take place March 20th to 24th in 2023, and I want to make sure that you sign up for it and visit some of the great events that were happening around Research and Innovation Week. If you've got a question for the panel, Tony Almaguer is on here and you can direct message him, or you can email us at research@uc.edu. That's research@uc.edu. And we're going to try to ask some of our panelists some of these questions. I'm going to get right to the panel. First is Tom Talovich. He is the department head of the UC Biomedical Engineering faculty and an expert on CTE and other brain injuries. And we're going to be leaning on him a lot for what all of this actually is. Reggie Williams is a former linebacker with the hometown Cincinnati Bengals and the author of the terrific book Resilient by Nature. So thanks, Reggie, for joining us. And then there's Bobby DeMars. He is a former USC football player and an award-winning filmmaker. His film, The Business of Amateurs, deals with how the governing bodies and collegiate athletes have not always looked out for student athletes' best interests. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to get right to it. Tom, I wanted you to talk a little bit about your research and how it applies to the subject at hand.
Right. So for the past 13 years, I and several of my colleagues have been working in the area of subconcussive injury. So what we've been trying to understand is how when a player or an individual, whether they're an athlete or just someone at home, ends up suffering a head injury or head impact, not necessarily even something they would consider an injury per se. In others, they don't necessarily go see a doctor or don't have symptoms. How do those head impacts, those head accelerations alter the brain chemistry, alter the brain physiology? And more critically, for those athletes or for individuals who participate in sport, how do those repeated head accelerations accumulate to produce or make a greater risk of a notable injury, what we would call a concussion, and potentially lead to or create the basis for long-term neurodegenerative disorders that we know are associated with collision-based sports, things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or, as is very well known in the public domain at this point in time, chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Got it. I mean, it's fascinating stuff, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it and how it applies to these things as we go through the panel. First, I wanted to get Reggie and Bobby your stories. I think it's going to be really important for our audience to actually understand how you come about it. Reggie, you played in the NFL. You were on the All Ricky team. You've had a great success in college and in professional athletics, and you played through a lot of injuries. And you're actually donating your brain to science. How did you realize something was going on in your brain?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think this is a great subject matter to talk about. I mean, football is America's sport. Everyone loves their athletes, their favorite team. You know, there's a difference from physical injuries like a knee injury versus a brain injury. And unfortunately, you know, the research is really needed because brain injuries brings a certain stigma to it. That is a negative stigma that needs to be addressed with better research and more solutions. I actually had my very first concussion before I even started playing football in the 9th grade. I fell out of a tree doing exactly what my mother told me not to do. And I was unable to play football in the 9th grade because of that. My head was so swollen, I couldn't fit a helmet on. And it wasn't until I got into the NFL that I got my second concussion. I didn't get a concussion when I did start playing in high school. I didn't suffer a concussion my whole 4 years at Dartmouth College. But come the big game, NFL, I had at least 3 concussions that I know about. And according to Dr. Omalo, who, you know, was the doctor, you know, referenced, played by Will Smith in the movie Concussion, I had a chance to hear him speak, and he guaranteed that I had a CTE. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm donating my brain is if there's the ability to dissect what consequences there were from the times that I did suffer concussions, and that research can help another generation of athletes to eliminate the stigma, then that's really why I'm on this phone call. And one of the other things that I talked to Tom about earlier is what are the consequences of anesthesia? I mean, those affect the brain as well. And while I've had like 4 concussions, I've been under anesthesia for injuries suffered playing football, knee injuries, knee replacements, and aorta dissection. So I've been under anesthesia 28 times. So is there an issue, you know, with the combination, with the, you know, the brutality of football and the consequences of brain injuries, and the fact that you're suffering other injuries throughout the rest of your body? And what does that do for you long-term? And those are the kind of things that I think players want to know, because there's a machismo aspect of the game. You know, we're supposed to be able to withstand the worst that our opponent can give us. We're supposed to withstand the worst of the weather. You know, we're the only sport that plays in the coldest of weather, the rain, sleet, snow, whatever. So I think there's a great opportunity to really benefit future generations of aspiring athletes in the many sports you talked about, Jay, with the research being done now to provide some kind of solution for CTE.
Yeah. Appreciate that very much, Bobby. I love you played for the USC Trojans. Tell us about your story. When did you realize you had a concussion problem?
You know, I think I don't know how many concussions I had. I mean, they keep changing the rules. You know, I guess every time you see a white light, I probably had you know, over 100 of these things. That seemed to happen almost every day in practice, if you think about it. You know, you just call being dinged or something like that. But in terms of losing time, you know, for me, the impetus for making the business of amateurs really focuses on what we think is the inarguable rights related to, you know, academic integrity, but we focus a lot on the brain. And the catalyst for it was Scott Ross. Scott Ross was the linebacker next to Junior Seau at USC, and he was a wrecking ball. And he actually was friends with my roommate, and my roommate said, "Hey, can my buddy crash on the couch?" I'm like, "Scott Ross, this guy's a legend." And at the time he was 39, and he'd been diagnosed with dementia. And Scott is a thread in our film. And by the way, the link is free for anybody to watch it right now. We created a link for everybody. And he died while we were making the film. And there's still some ambiguity as to whether, you know, he killed himself on purpose or accidentally. You know, his body gave out on him when he was in an alcoholic binge. And there's a lot of guilt that comes with highlighting his story and making the film, and that it amplifies it. And while I was making the film, actually at the start of it, I started having panic attacks. And I think a lot of people would assume like, oh, you're about to do something stressful, so you're stressful. So when people have panic attacks, a lot of times they're traumatized, and there's different triggers for that. Whereas I don't have a trigger. My brain can literally just malfunction. It's a latent part of our brain where we used to be food for other animals, where it's like fight, flight, or really freeze. And when you lose your ability to control your thoughts, it's actually very uncomfortable. It makes you more susceptible to them. And brain cells are unmyelinated, and what happens is it's not like you get hit and then your brain cells die. So they're unmyelinated, so they don't grow back, but they get traumatized. And about 13, 14, 15 years, they harden to this tau protein. Now that can create misfires in the brain that are related to depression, anxiety, ALS. I mean, we cover in the film, Lou Gehrig had several well-documented head injuries. He probably, had CTE. And so the film was made for the purpose of trying to highlight this. I think what a lot of people overlook about athletes in general, not just football players, every athlete, athletes are very prideful in nature. So to admit that there's a deficiency that most people associate with your identity is really difficult to come to terms with. And since making the film, I've had over 100 athletes come up to me and almost in hushed tones say, I have what you have. And ultimately, I'm very vocal about it. I don't think I come across as somebody that has a mental disorder, but I'm very vocal about it because I try to pull that stigma out. Like Reggie, I've donated my brain. I'm the 91st person to pledge their brain for the Concussion Legacy Foundation, which is interesting because my football number was 91. So that was kind of a coincidence. And we made the film to try to push this. A lot of times I get asked, somebody will say, well, would you go out? Would you play football again? And if I didn't make the film, I wouldn't. Trading my long-term mental health for the sake of this very ephemeral, fleeting moments of glory that get romanticized with running out of the tunnel and all that stuff. I'd rather have student debt as opposed to that. And I mean, and at SC it would have been a lot. And I'm grateful for the opportunities that I had at my school, but I always felt like an athlete student. I always thought sports were put first, and I didn't really feel like everybody was looking out for my best interests. And the film's gone on to create reform in NIL, and I thought that was going to be the last thing that came into place. To me, brain injuries are at the forefront, and a lot of times, they don't know what the long-term cost is, so nobody wants to take no one wants to take on any of the liability. I mean, Scott Ross's team, there's I think six or seven people that are dead from that defense. So Junior Seau, Scott Ross, Matt Gee just lost a lawsuit last week related to suing the NCAA for his head injuries. And it's kind of like, well, did it start at football? Did it happen when Reggie fell out of the tree? So there's that process. And who do we know that happens? We can't diagnose until you're dead. How do we know this person just wasn't, an alcoholic from hereditary? So there's a lot of unanswered questions out there. And
so that's
the film kind of
an amazing thing that six members of it are dead from that defense. That's amazing. And your excellent film that I watched last week, and we'll make sure that everyone that was watching this gets a link to it because it's something worth watching. There's a scene where you are actually donating your brain to science. Talk about that a little bit here, and I want to get into that. And Reggie's doing the same thing, but that was a very poignant scene where you're actually on the phone trying to figure out how to give your brain to science.
Yeah, I mean, we were lucky. We cold called the Concussion Legacy Foundation, which was founded by Chris Nowinski, who's a Harvard football player, and we literally shot a third of the film in one weekend. Out of 77 days, one weekend, we got Dr. Robert Cantu, we got Dr. Ann McKee, who really kind of lead the brain bank over in Boston, and we dissected brains that day. And at that moment, I said, I'm going to pledge my brain for donation, so that this is right behind my driver's license. So, and it says to harvest my brainstem and my brain so that they can study it and hopefully help other people and find solutions. And I'm hoping they can find a way. I know they're at the forefront of trying to diagnose this. I know Tom probably knows more about this, trying to diagnose CTE before I'm dead. But my problems hit literally 13 years right after I finished playing football. And I think people overlook the subconcussive blows too. 1,500, 900, 1,500 subconcussive blows per year. And I know that played a role, I think, in what happened to me.
Tom, these brain banks and these athletes that are donating their brains to science, which is going to really help humanity for going forward. Talk about that a little bit. I mean, Bobby talks about having 100+ concussions, perhaps. Reggie doesn't have any idea. How does this? What are the brain banks looking at? Tell us a little bit about that.
So the brain banks are primarily looking at, obviously postmortem histology. So they're going through and trying to identify areas within the brain where we have clear breakdown. So CTE in particular, there's these basically tangled fibers, tangled material that is building up within the cells. It collects within the brain and then it kind of spreads out from a point where it originates, and it starts to basically destroy the tissue as in an ever-growing region. And so what they're really trying to do is go through the individuals who've experienced a history of blows to the head or a history of concussions, identify the prevalence of these sort of tangles within the brain, how much of the brain is actually damaged, how much of the brain has essentially suffered cell death, and then use that information to try to identify based on known histories. And particularly in the case of people like Reggie and Bobby, where they are still alive, they can interview them, they can get information about their playing history, their life history, to try to use that whole large list of data to identify what factors seem to be the primary cause of this. And then are there individuals who seem to be more or less susceptible to this type of neurodegenerative disorder? Because there is almost certainly going to be some level of a genetic component. And that way, maybe we have individuals where we can say to them early on, don't play. Or we have others where it's like, okay, it's probably okay for you to go play, but we need to start watching for these other metrics. And that's where we get into the subconcussive exposures. How do we limit? How do we control how much injury you're taking on a day-to-day basis, essentially?
That's fascinating. Before we started this panel, I had no idea that something like this existed. I'm glad it does. Reggie, you were talking a little bit about the machismo that exists in the NFL and in sports and in a lot of sports. I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about that, expound upon that. There's expectations that you go out there and, sometimes you go in the cold weather, there's not that much of an effect, but the fact that you may have to go back in once you're dinged up, but it might be doing long-term damage to you. I'd like you to talk a little about the expectations a pro athlete faces there.
Yeah, I mean, especially for the position that I played, linebacker. A linebacker is part of our goal is to intimidate our opponents. The best compliment that an opponent can give you is that they don't come your way at all. Because if they do come your way, there's pain to be suffered. And so they're giving you, everything that they've got to knock you out, so to speak. And so
I will say this too, as you keep going with your answer, you leaned in a little bit there to answer. I was a little intimidated myself, so you still got it, but please go ahead.
No, it's a mentality, and especially coming from the Ivy League as a linebacker, there was so much curiosity about whether I could play big time ball. In fact, when I went to the Hula Bowl, the Big Ten defensive coordinator refused to play me because he just made this major assumption that even though he's an All-American, he's from Dartmouth College, there's no way I'm gonna put him on the field. And so it creates self-doubt in oneself. So there was a part where I had to prove that I was tough enough. And my rookie year in training camp, I had to fight every single day to prove that I belonged in the uniform. And the first time that, or the worst time I will say, that I had a concussion on the field, it was because I ran into two players on the goal line. And we had this old adage as a defense that you never let a rookie get into your end zone standing up. Something that stupid, that you would, bring a massive concussion to yourself for something that is really just, old player talk. And, but I did it. And when I hit the ground and the ground is moving like this, and I don't know if I can get up, and I just happen to reach out to a pair of orange stockings and assuming that that's a teammate, and that person pulled me up and got me to the sideline. I went right to our team doctor, Dr. Height, and I told him I was hurt, but he looked at me physically there was nothing hurt. There was nothing bleeding. There wasn't anything swollen. And I'm saying, but I'm hurt. I'm hurt. And then all of a sudden on the kickoff, we had a turnover, and instinctively I ran back on the field. And for 3 more plays, not knowing what's going on, I'm on the field. And fortunately, no one ran at me or anything like that, or I would have been hurt even worse. And I went back to the sideline, was halftime, went into the locker room, iced my head, didn't know where specifically to ice, but ultimately, I guess I broke my orbital bone right in between here. And when I went out to the second half, and I'm getting ready to start, no one is stopping me. There's no tool rule, I'm getting ready to go. I just blow my nose one time, and that forced my eyeball to blow up like a balloon. And I ran back to the doctor. I said, see, I told you I was hurt. But, I'm not proud of that. I mean, I went immediately to the hospital and spent the second half in some hospital in Houston. And it fortunately was the last game of the season in 1987. And I didn't have to prove myself by coming back the next week. But certainly, when you talk about, when do you know you had a CTE or a consequence of some kind of brain damage? It probably when I was an executive at Disney. And one of the things that I imposed on our organization was that Mickey Mouse and Goofy were not allowed at the sports complex. We were about authenticity. And when you step back and say, wow, when you have a problem with Mickey Mouse, you probably also have CTE,
Bobby, Reggie talks a lot about, being let down, it sounds like, by some of the powers that be. And your film talks about players' rights. I get, this is kind of a sense that I'm getting, and it's a through line here where the folks that control the operations, they control these large organizations, they're really letting their players down. How do you feel that? Do you feel that the powers that be left you down? And talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, look, here's the reality. I think it was Upton St. Clair that said you can't count on a person to do the right thing when their job depends on them to not do the right thing. Everything's metrics now. Everything's money, and all of it's built around winning. Okay, so if you're going to start holding star players out, which is going to affect wins, right? You're probably not going to have a job for very long. Your job is to keep people on the field. When I was there, we had 3-a-days. Coach that loved me got fired 3 months into my freshman year. A new coach came in, told me to transfer. They didn't care that I, turned down Harvard and Stanford to go to USC for their business scholars program or their film school. They didn't care about that. And I was expendable. So I played 10 years with the football in 3 years. I'd go 80 snaps in a row. There was nobody counting that. We'd have 3-a-days for 24 days straight. And I'd go almost every snap in practice it was difficult, but everybody has kind of that different path. And I mean, there was a period where I don't talk about this in the film because I don't think there'd be empathy for it. But after having 2 years of 3-a-days and being the only player that didn't miss a practice, I got a form of PTSD from that because I was playing hurt and injured and exhausted, and I started vomiting in my sleep, waking up vomiting at August, a week before camp started. And I didn't realize until 8 years later that, and I had therapy, that I was basically, I vomited every August for 8 years straight. I was traumatized from having to push myself beyond my physical and mental limits. And I started vomiting every day, like nonstop. And I lost 30 pounds in 5 days. What's crazy is you weigh in before and after every practice. So there's literally a chart where you see I went from 255 to 225 in 5 days. And there's no alarms going off. And then I passed out in the shower. And there was this guy at UC Irvine where we practiced that used to swim there every day. It was like 85, 90. And I remember him trying to lift me off the shower. He found me unconscious in the shower. And that was a moment of clarity for me. And the thing about athletes, are you hurt or are you injured? Like what Reggie was talking about, like you're waiting for someone to save you because you don't want to show weakness and you're still competing. And I went into the training room, and one of the people that was pre-med, and this is how stupid I was thankful that she recognized I didn't say anything. She's like, your lips are purple. You need to sit down. I was white, my lips were purple, and I didn't have a pulse. And she pulled me aside later, said I had all the signs I was about to go into cardiac arrest.
Oh, wow.
They hooked me up with the saline. The only doctor that could put an actual thing, Dr. Taboni, who just did my dad's shoulder replacement, and he hadn't put a needle in somebody's arm in 14 years, and the vein collapsed, and they tried to get in the other one. And I went through 8 bags of saline. They ran out of saline. You're supposed to have it until you have to pee. I didn't pee for 24 hours. And they sent me to the doctor. I'd been vomiting so much that my esophagus closed. And so I was wheezing. And they stuck a camera down my throat. They didn't find anything. And I was practicing the next day. And I kind of look back, for me, that was like people are like, well, it was all worth it in the end. And I don't talk about that in the film because I don't really think there is empathy within the sports culture world. Yeah, everybody will say, well, you were lucky to do this, or they can call you any expletive that they want, that I was weak. And I'm like, dude, I did all these things because when you go to play in college or in the NFL, you're carrying everybody, and there's a baggage for that. You're the star of your town. And I don't know if you remember Hoop Dream, but he said, everybody comes up to me and says, hey man, if you make it when you're big time, man, don't forget about me. And he says, well, look, if I don't make it, don't forget about me. And I was struggling emotionally, and there was no mental health resources for me there. I went to Bible study, and that I kind of leaned on scripture. I mean, I'm a spiritual person. I'm not really religious, but I was trying to find answers, and I didn't have anyone to talk to about that. And schools are coming around, they're creating resources, but you can look at what happened with Simone Biles and people, Osaka in the industry, mental health resources need to be there. It's not just brain injuries. These people are pushing themselves beyond the brink. And at some point you will break. And I found that point physically and mentally.
And this is college athletics you're talking about, and it just doesn't impact football. It is other sports we talked about. We'll get into that a little bit too. But I've heard horror stories about women's athletics too, where they're expected to because, like you said, it is about winning at all costs at a lot of these institutions. Reggie, we're going to go into some of these other the youth programs and what our young people should know. But I do want to know: are you still suffering the effects of concussions right now?
I would say that, as anyone who is aging and you have memory lapses, you wonder, where is that coming from? Is it from, repeated concussions? Is it from, all of this anesthesia? Is it from playing bare armed at 59 degrees below zero wind chill when you try to get to your first Super Bowl? I mean, for me, it's all about research. My assumption is that I already do have CTE. So my goal is to look at what are solutions today. What are opportunities next week? What are things that I can be doing in my personal lifestyle that will prevent the most negative aspects of CTE? And, the most negative aspect, of course, is when you get so depressed, I'm told, that, you get suicidal. And so that's one of the things that I have most concern about. And it's the reason why I'm very, very interested in seeing what the solutions are. There was good news today, about a potential solution for what is that, Tom?
Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Alzheimer's, yeah.
A little memory lapse there. On Alzheimer's. Now, it wasn't perfect. Some of the consequences include brain swelling and I guess a brain bleeding, but there seemed to be, a 27% improvement, in the dire consequence of Alzheimer's. And so in that respects, I'm looking for someone that can say, hey, mushrooms, psychedelics, medical cannabis, other pharmaceuticals, what are solutions? And that's really, my purpose in moving forward. Bob's film was very helpful. I thought he did a really good job, really talking about what the pressures are at the collegiate level. Fortunately, at Dartmouth, I didn't go through that same kind of pressure. In fact, Buddy Stevens, the head coach of Dartmouth right now, he's the one that has introduced tackling dummies so that none of his players are having contact in practice. And so that probably has saved a whole bunch of brain matter, and it's starting to percolate throughout the NFL and other college campuses, but it's still not, wholesomely embraced. And so you still want to look at what are the solutions today to protect the minds of athletes competing in one of the greatest sports ever. I'm biased, but I grew up in the era where baseball was the #1 sport in America. And it wasn't until, during the middle of my career that the football slowly emerged, as the most popular sport. And probably the reason it, emerged was because of its brutality. Everyone watching basically cringed and said, wow, I'm glad that's not me in that field. But most of the injuries that you see are physical injuries and not brain injuries. And obviously there's a lot of a focus on brain injuries now because of the long-term consequences. You will come back from an ACL tear, but there's no guarantee that you'll come back from a concussion.
Hugely important message. I want to talk a little bit about these other sports, Tom. We focus a lot about football because we've got some great guests on this, and obviously that gets a lot of the media attention right now. But this affects soccer players. It affects a lot of our young women that are in gymnastics and lacrosse, any of these contact sports or places. I want you to talk a little bit about that too, because I know we've got a lot of athletic trainers that are interested in this issue,
Right.
that are tuning in. What should they be thinking about here, and how do you think about that?
Right. I mean, anytime you have a sport where you've got some sort of rapid head acceleration that can take place. So obviously we see that visibly in football and in soccer. We have a tackler when we have a header, or if we have rugby and we have a tackle down to the ground, lacrosse. But, certainly when you get into things like gymnastics or you get into cheerleading, well, cheerleading, there's a lot of head injuries anyway, because the girls unfortunately get dropped a lot by the guys. But when they actually are on the beam, for example, whipping around, or when they're doing a dismount in gymnastics and you land on the ground really hard and really sharply, even if it's on your feet, there are pretty good forces that are actually, put upon the brain. And all of those repeated accelerations actually are causing some low level of cellular damage, some low level of structural injury to the brain. And as those accrue time after time after time, that's when we start to see changes in the actual function, the brain chemistry, the brain structure that often are worse than are actually observed in the case of a diagnosed concussion. And what's really happening here is that each of these individual blows, if they don't happen to cause a dysfunction in terms of my ability to complete a task you asked me to do, you're going to conclude I'm healthy. And it's exactly to the point Reggie was saying. He came off the field, the guy looked at him, he's not bleeding, so he must be fine. And if I can still do a task, I can still give you what day of the week it is, I can still tell you what quarter is, the assumption is I'm healthy. But in fact, I may be a little slower in that response than I normally would be. Maybe I'm a little cloudy and I made a good guess at the last second. It's always these little subconcussive, we kind of talk about them in that context, subconcussive injuries, but what they really are saying is that this low level accumulation, and eventually we make it so it doesn't take that huge blow to give you a concussion. The good example from football, Chris Steelman from the Chargers a number of years ago was an offensive lineman. He got hit just on the play where he was blocking. There was nothing special about the play, yet that play led to him being removed from the game because he had a concussion. He ended up having seizures on the plane and stuff. Very large issue there, but that small blow probably just pushed him over that edge to now one of those systems in his brain that allows him to get information from point A to point B broke. Information couldn't get there. He now was unable to function. And so, yeah, when we're dealing with from the perspective of looking at athletes or working with athletes, we really, what our research that we're doing about is in large part, how do we prevent that buildup? How do we get it? So like using the MVP dummy that Buddy Stevens developed there at Dartmouth, how do we go about saying, hey, let's not get hit 300 times during the week just so you can get hit 100 times or be involved in 100 collisions during the football game on a Friday night for a high school football player. By knocking out a large percentage of those blows, odds are very good, we can at least reduce the accumulation of injury or reduce the risk of a major injury. On top of that, maybe we can come up, and this is what a lot of our research is about, is how do we predict when you're getting closer and closer to that point where we need to pull you back so that if you're doing anything, you're just missing practice. Because I know, and I'm sure that if there had been a way for Reggie and Bobby to continue to play without all those blows, or to at least know that they're playing and they have a much reduced risk of being injured, yeah, they'd probably be okay giving up a practice in order to play the game, just because at least that's the fun, that's the competition component. And that's what we really need the trainers to be thinking about when they're working with the athletes. Who's going too strong? Who's going too hard? Can you pick up, just like Bobby was saying, that you've got this person going, 3-a-days as opposed to 1-a-days for everybody else? How do you keep that player from putting themselves at risk?
And Tom, have you seen, high school athletic associations and trainers associations and, even like Pee Wee football or those kinds of folks, people that are in charge of these, are they embracing this? What's going on out there, or are they working with you? How's that looking?
Right. We do know that over time, like for example, USA Soccer did ban heading below the age of 12. So that was a very good decision by theirs. That was largely based on a lot of the research we'd done at the time. You have had a number of efforts, a number of locations, a number of school systems, not at a large level. Athletic associations are making too much money off of this, to tie into the point that Bobby was making there. For them to give up tackle football at young ages, I mean, you still have, Friday night tykes down there in Texas with 6-year-olds slamming into one another. The key here is that some school systems recognize this, encourage their students to only play flag football up until 14, so that they at least aren't involved in head collisions, but they're still developing a lot of the skills. So you've got soccer and football have made some football folks have made a move on that. Athletic trainers are definitely more attuned to this. It's becoming a bigger and bigger issue for them. But what they really need are tools that are going to help them, because if you're one athletic trainer or even maybe you have an assistant, if you're lucky at a high school where you have 100 kids on the football team, you can't truly monitor all 100 of those kids effectively. So that's really where, again, that's where a lot of our research is going. How do we go about detecting these acceleration events? How do we go about deciding if they're going to be meaningful? How do we go about providing additional information to the coaches and the players, and the coaches and the trainers, especially the coaches, realistically? Because the athletic trainer can say they want to hold them out, but again, like Bobby said, unless they are completely independent of the line of command with the coaches and the athletic department, their job depends on getting that kid back out on the field, not on taking care of the kid. So if you can make it so that the coach understands they're going to get better performance out of this player, if I pull them from this practice, I'm going to get better performance in the game. That's kind of the direction we feel we have to go to make this work. Except in rare cases, and we are very fortunate here where our athletic training staff and our sports medicine staff here at UC have a long history of research in this domain and pushing things and actually being able to make sure things happen within the athletic department to care for athletes. We're very fortunate here. If you don't have that situation, we need those tools and we need that messaging. Let's get a better player by taking care of them.
And to our audience, if you have a question, please email us at research@uc.edu and we'll try to ask it. We're getting a few in now. Reggie, what do you want parents of young athletes to think about?
I do agree with the notion of stopping young players from playing tackle football till they're, in their mid-teens, whether 14, 15 years old. It just coincidentally happened to be my situation as well, because of the concussion I had in the 9th grade, which is about that same frame. With athletic trainers and coaches, they need to save the player from themselves. We want to play. We want to be in the huddle. We want to be with our teammates. We want to win. We want to contribute to the winning. And, there's nothing that you would regret more than when you aren't in there. I mean, one of my biggest nightmares is not because of injury, but because of the type of defense that Dick LeBeau, our defensive coordinator, was calling during the final moments of Super Bowl 23. There was nothing worse than being on the sideline, watching your team get beat in the final second. There's nothing you can do about it. And so, an injury, or whether it's a brain injury or a leg injury or whatnot, you still would rather be on the field. And that's one of the things that I think the more knowledge that we all have about, immediate symptoms, reasons to really, hold a player back. If there's something dilating in their eyeballs or something that really shows that someone is having, a problem beyond their ability to just be a tough guy, then that's something that you really need to inform everyone about. And I'm not sure, is University of Cincinnati taking advantage of some of your research, Tom?
Yeah, we are actually partnered with our sports medicine department, so we're hoping to be working with many of the athletes in the coming year. We're in the process of putting together a study for non-collision sport athletes to look at, for example, shoulders for throwing athletes and knees for jumping athletes. And so I believe it's a wonderful situation here where we have a research-oriented athletic training staff and sports medicine staff. Part of the reason I came here.
That's a great question, Reggie. Bobby, how have young athletes embraced your message? Have they seen the movie? Are they thinking about this?
We got a lot of pushback from fans initially because they didn't really know what I was doing with it. And, I said some bad things about some coaches. That it tells you a little bit more about the sports culture. I got a couple of death threats out of nowhere, which is super weird.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I had a coach that Ed Ogeron, I've talked about in the press. He used to cuss me out for leaving practice early in the spring to go to a business class that started at 6. That professor, if you were literally late once, you dropped a grade. There was this, I was not showering, I was running in there sweating by seconds, and he would cuss me out and call me every name under the sun because he thought I cared more about school than football. So the sports culture is dangerous in and of itself. And when you're kind of fighting the system, like, it's a religion to people, the stadiums are cathedrals to people. They hang their hats on all this stuff. To answer your question, are young people embracing it? I think a lot of them shy away from wanting to know too much information, unfortunately. I don't think they're educated enough on knowing what anxiety is and not being anxious about something, but having an anxiety disorder. The difference between being depressed about something and actual depression. Reggie talked about, people that are suicidal. If anyone's ever experienced depression, I've experienced depression because I had a knee surgery from football, 20 years later, and I had to have a ligament repaired that caused another ligament to snap. Just put my knee on the bed. I wasn't even doing anything athletic. And my wife was giving me 1 Percocet every 6 hours instead of 2 every 3. And I got behind the pain, so I had to take 4 every 3 hours. And the withdrawals of that, it triggered depression. And I empathize with people that are suicidal because of that. Because when you are in depression, you feel like you're never going to get out of it. Same thing with anxiety attack. You feel like your brain's broken, and it induces anxiety, and it creates triggers for there to be more anxiety. So I don't think kids are educated on that. I think some of them don't want to know that. They don't want to know that they're putting the long-term mental health at risk. Parents don't really want to know that. Any parent that has their kid in tackle football, I wouldn't go so far as to maybe say it's child abuse. I would say if you're educated on it, that's controversial. My kid's not playing college football, not going to play Pop Warner football. There's no way. Now that I know everything and I'm educated about it, but people want to compartmentalize these different things so that it fits their needs and their pride and their ego. And they don't want to get in the way of their potential glory. And as Reggie said, yeah, you need somebody that's looking out for these people, because athletes are going to push themselves beyond the brink. And yeah, I've had a lot of athletes later on, most athletes in college are enlightened on their way out the door. But when you come in, yeah, you might be all-state and all-American. You're competing with everyone else that's all-state and all-American. So you're going to do anything you can to get on that field and to not, let anyone down, and to try to keep those moments of glory going. But yeah, we've had a lot of positive response, and I didn't, make the school look bad. I think I made North Carolina look a little bad. Boston
They
College
deserved it.
looked
Take a few eggs for a big message like this. Okay. So we've got some questions from the audience. I want to get to those too, because I know people are starting to care about or have got some specific things they want to get to. Tom, this is directly for you. What do you feel is the potential impact of AI coupled with imaging technology on accurately predicting safe return to play? I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, actually, this is one of the topics we are actually involved with So we've been assembling a team here at UC since I got here a couple of years ago, through the College of Medicine, well as through biomedical engineering, through computer science. And so we actually are bringing to bear a lot of tools and a lot of faculty who have expertise. So by combining monitoring of athletes during participation in collision-based sports with information such as, for example, simple just words segmentation, word analysis of, say, social media postings, their emails, their communications with their coaches, along with very simple external measures that the athletic trainers are already collecting on a regular basis, you do have a good opportunity to pick up the fact that they've got some sort of injury. You've got an opportunity to pick up that they're starting to suffer mental health issues. But then on top of that, you can establish what defines normal for an individual, and it's on an individual basis then, so that following an actual injury, you have an opportunity to decide, are we back to normal function? Are we back to normal physiology? Now let's get them back out there. So rather than just kind of going with a generic 6 days or 13 days, or gee, if they can take this test successfully that I've now provided to them 7 times over the last 6 days, you can actually get an accurate measure of the health of an individual. So that's an exciting direction that we are working on investigating.
That's fascinating. I'm glad that question came up. So I've got another question here from the audience. Are we seeing major or incremental changes with concussion support? How can we accelerate change? Policy, research? So I guess I'll frame it this way, and I'll ask it to Reggie and to Bobby. Reggie first. If there's one policy or one research effort taken apart, taken under that you think could help solve this problem, what would you be looking for?
That's what we've talked about from the beginning. What are some of the solutions? The long-term solutions is to prevent any further damage. So that's obviously, the algorithm that everyone has to look at. I mean, are you doing a person a significant favor by strictly saying after your first concussion, you're out for 6 months? Or you're out for a year? Or is it like, Cincinnati Bengal running back Joe Mixon, who had a concussion 2 weeks ago when he was pulled off the field? There weren't any real demonstrative issues. I didn't see the contact. I didn't see him laying on the field. I saw him going into the tent, and then he missed the rest of the game, and then he missed the next week, and he's going to miss the following week. So, there are some advances in the organization looking out after the long-term health, but I don't know specifically what it was that made his concussion worse than Tua's when he only was out for 1 week. I don't know what the metrics are, but I think those are things that you're searching for, that the athletic channels are looking for.
Bobby, if you had a magic wand, you could change one thing, or you can get one piece of research that you needed. What do you think is the thing that is like just absolutely a must-have?
I think more research and understand about how hyperbaric chambers are helping people. That was seen as a pseudoscience, and it's been really helpful for a lot of players that have trying to recover from brain injuries and brain fog and things like that. I think monitoring hits through sensors and force and how many times, you can remove the head from tackle football, but the linemen are still going to be smashing heads like 2 Rams every single play. But I actually, tried to create a health plan. Once again, it's not in the documentary. I couldn't pull it off. I spent a year creating a health plan that would cover every athlete at the school for the next 60 years. Men, women, walk on, everybody at that school for the injuries they sustain in the sport that year. So if you need your knee redone or whatever it is, like you're covered for that injury for the next 60 years. And I couldn't get anyone to cover it without having the exception of head injuries, because we don't know what that sunken cost is. There's these public bads that are being put out, which means, hey, this person that can't work because they have dementia from all the football, well, that's going to be a drain on society. And the reality is, I don't think the schools want to know the damage that they're doing. I tried to make USC be the hero of the film, and I tried to create a health plan and make them, because my goal was to get them to adopt a policy and enforce competition. Sure. Because that's the problem with recruiting somebody. They're going to get an education. I'm going to take care of your kid. And those are both empty promises, because it's all about getting that recruit there. And they put all these obstacles in front of me. They said I had to get through compliance, and then the football board, and then the athletic department, and then the school president, and then the conference. And I said, all right, well, give me the give me the name of the compliance guy. And I met with him. And then Scott Ross died, and I got mad about it. And I didn't want them to be the hero anymore. But I still tried to pursue it. And at the end of the day, I couldn't get anybody to adopt that policy anyways without having that exclusion because of the long-term liability that's associated with head injuries.
Well, sometimes change takes a long time, but you've certainly started with a huge idea. I mean, and that is like a monumental idea if that could take place. Another question from the audience. I don't know if anyone has an opinion on this. What are your thoughts on the Q collar? It was actually developed here in our backyard at Cincinnati Children's. I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts on that.
So just as disclosure, I actually served as a consultant on their application to the FDA for approval. So I wasn't involved in any of the research about it. It's an interesting idea. It actually is evidence from an imaging perspective that it could well be preventing some level of low-level brain structure, some degree of low-level brain structural damage. The concerns with the back pressure that it generates within the vasculature are just simply that if you have individuals who maybe are already at risk of hypertension or have some aneurysm risk, it's an interesting question to explore. What is the potential, or what risks might be involved in that consequence? But as a passive tool that's a low-cost intervention, it is an interesting device. And as I said, there is some evidence that it provides protection to the athletes. Certainly the brain imaging data say that the athletes who wore the collar, high school athletes who were playing football who wore the collar, experienced fewer changes, or at least less severe changes than those who didn't.
What is the Q collar? Is that the collar that you wear?
Yeah, it sits around, it presses in on the jugular area. So it creates a back pressure within the head. The idea here is it mimics sort of in the woodpecker, they have as their tongue wraps around their brain, they end up with a large amount of pressure. And so you essentially are reducing the ability of the kind of the density effect from the brain versus the cerebrospinal fluid. You're making it all be just as high pressure and unable to move as possible. So it's got some interesting potential, but as I said, I think there are some other questions to be explored that I would like to explore about it. And yeah, so but it does actually show evidence of preventing some level of injury. It doesn't prevent all injury, but the injury was at a lesser rate of accrual.
Yeah, I wore a collar my whole NFL career. I didn't feel a need to wear it in high school. I didn't feel a need to wear it in college. Once I got to the NFL, and really after the first practice, I said, "Pick me up for something," because it just kind of prevented from moving as much during impact. Right. So any sophistication on that, I would welcome. Sure, and I'm sure it's like today there's just better equipment. There's better helmets. Yeah. There's better playing surfaces. There's better shoes. There's so much better equipment, but still,
but it's still not well designed.
Body,
it's still not well designed, though, Reggie. The helmets they do better in the test that they provide, but they don't necessarily absorb the better energy. So there's still room to be improved there. The turf is still harder and worse for you than dirt. And if you don't recondition it regularly, it becomes even worse. We've done research on all these areas as a team. So yeah, and the shoes, that's a whole other issue. But no, there's, and the key is there's a lot of room for improvement. It's just a matter of getting it to happen. And that is a little more challenging in an environment where the organizations actually run the certification organization itself. So the companies that produce the products run the certification so they can kind of block out whoever they want. So it's a big topic, and there is a huge room for improvement. And I think if we do that, we do the monitoring as Bobby highlighted, we can do a very large amount for the prevention so that more kids can play these sports much more safely. That really is feasible.
So we've only got a few minutes left, and I've got a ton of other questions, but I do want to end with one more. And Tom, I'm going to come back to you for the last one. UC is leading the way. What your research is leading the way, and right now you've got some great experts, people that have actually suffered some of the effects of this horrific issue. Bobby's here, Reggie's here. How can you at UC, how can UC be a convening authority? How can it, beyond just some of the research you're doing, to actually change policy? So a major research university here, how can we actually go change policy for the better using some of our newfound friends?
No, so this is a big issue. So by having people like Reggie and Bobby around and advocates and partners that we also have in like Chris Nowinski and the Concussion Legacy Foundation, when we're able to connect with these people, we're able to get together these larger policies. I mean, another individual that we'd like to get involved would be Catherine Snedeker of Pink Concussions, who focuses on women's issues in these consequences, sports and military. When we have these large groups and we get these larger platforms and we have these individuals who have an ability to spread the information, then you can start providing the evidence that the research is producing. You provide the data, provide the support. You have a partnership like we have here with between sports medicine, athletics, and the research side to be able to document that, hey, UC's football team has a substantially lower rate of concussions than almost every other institution in the country. And oh, by the way, the one year they didn't implement their protocols, they spiked and they matched everybody else in the country. So it's a way to be able to document that there are strategies, there are pathways that provide benefit. And now once you have that evidence, now you get the public out there to be aware of it. And then you can go push this up through, for example, our Vice President of Research office. We can get this to the Lieutenant Governor, to the governor's office, and try to get some pressure on those athletic associations to get them to start making a positive change that's going to really improve the health of the athletes.
Well, let's make sure we end on that note, because that's the kind of thing that's in my background. I'd love to be able to help you, all of you, try to fix this, because your stories are so compelling and your voices are very well needed. Bobby, you have one more thing?
I just want to, there's a lot of people on this call right now that work for a university, and they're trainers and they work in athletic departments and things like that. And look, the mixed emotions of wanting to do the right thing, and look, that ambivalence is there. You can love your school, you can love your job, and this is what we do with things we care about, our friends, our family, our loved ones. We push them to be better. So there's nothing wrong with loving your school and wanting it to be better.
What a great message to end with. Look, I want to thank all of our guests. I want to thank the Office of Research for putting this on. Remind you that Research and Innovation Week is going to be on March 20th, and it's going to go through the 24th in 2023. This conversation that we just had will be archived on the Digital Futures YouTube channel, so you'll be able to pass it around and share with other folks too, because it's a really important message. We're going to be having more in the Flashpoint series in the year, so we hope you'll join us. Thanks so much.